Do I have bars? I have bars! And I have bars. Oh, that was dumb. Okay. Yeah. Okay. If you could position that generally pointing towards your mouth, and you can, run it inside and up to the collar, or you can clip it on the outside, or whatever you'd like to do is fine.
We're going to flip it over so that we do it here.
That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, and if I could get you in the frame and start to just make sure that that's a good setup. I'm so sorry. That's why I have an extension cord, so I don't choke anybody. Okay. Let me, could I get you to move the chair back where it was?
Here?
To that, yeah, over here just a little bit, and that's beautiful. That just centers you a little bit better under the picture, and then you move your luggage out of the shot.
Yep, please. I wasn't sure where you were.
You don't know because you're not on the other side of the camera. That's great. Let me just. Okay. Can I grab this?
Yep.
Just get you centered and we'll be good to go. I think that's right. Let's do that. Okay. Perfect. So I'm going to sit over this way. And the deal with looking off camera is that you wind up looking like this in an interview. So it's not odd, even though you're not making eye contact with the camera. So I'll just get situated here, and let's see. It's about 2:30. You need to be in Vienna at 6. I don't think you need to worry about.
We should be out of here for sure by 5:30. Did you park down below?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Yeah. So
They do let people in sometimes.
They weren't sure what to do with me.
Yes. Well, I suspected that's what happened, and that's why I had asked you to be put on a list, which I think helped them below. But you never know what helps.
Well, and it's funny, how the hands talk and don't sometimes, because the fella outside had no idea, and the woman in the lobby was fine. Okay. So, I'm comfortable letting you run this as much as you want to. If you want to segue into another topic at any point, go right ahead. If you want me to go down the list.
I'll let you go down the list, and things may merge as you go.
Right.
Do you have the right volume?
Thank
One
you
check.
for reminding me. Yeah, let me do sing me a song.
I don't sing songs, but I talk and I motion with my hands.
I've got bars, and your hands are in frame. That's fantastic. Okay, so check, and check. Okay. Please tell me who you are, your name, and where you work, any committees that you're a member of that you think it's...
I'm Stephen Fienberg. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. I have a fancy title, but that's not what you want. I'm in the Department of Statistics and the Machine Learning Department, which is part of the School of Computer Science.
So you chaired the National Research Council's Committee to Review the Scientific Evidence on the Polygraph. How did that come about?
I've spent the better part of my professional life doing committees here at the National Academies, and at the time this was coming on the table, if I recall correctly, I was um, just, I was a member of the division in which a committee that was overseeing the area in which this study was going to occur, and the division executive director was looking for a member of the National Academy to chair the committee. And there were actually two committees that we were discussing, and I ended up chairing this one and serving on the other one, and they overlapped. I think there were two or three desiderata. One was that I was a member of the Academy, and there was an expectation that this was going to have political ramifications, and they liked that. They, meaning the people at the National Research Council, like to have the full prestige of the academies behind them. And secondly, I'm a scientist. I do evaluation of research as a piece of what I do. I do lots of other things. And the third criteria, which I like to tell people, which in some senses was the most important, is I had never read any of the literature on the polygraph, and I had never taken a position about the polygraph as a consequence. And so I think it's unfair to say I came with a blank slate, because I came with my scientific prejudices, but I certainly didn't come with any preconceived ideas about what the research in this area was like, or what it was that we would bring to the table and evaluate. I had a few clues, obviously, but I really didn't. I hadn't read any papers.
Thank you.
So ignorance is the.
In 2003, subsequent to the NRC committee's report, you subsequently testified in the Senate committee oversight hearing on the Department of Energy polygraph program, and it sounded like the DOE reversed or moderated its April position.
Right. So our report came out in October. This was actually, I've done a lot of these committees. It's the first time I had been front and center in a press conference. Typical reports of the sort I'm associated with don't have press conferences. They involve some technical aspect of the census, or what I think is really important research areas, but which the press tends not to focus on. We did a briefing of the sponsors in the Department of Education, of Energy, the sponsor. We briefed people on the Hill. We briefed, because the original impetus for the study was a congressional mandate. The Department of Energy was told to have the Academy do a study on the accuracy of the polygraph.
Was that because of the 1988 legislation saying you can't do this to private sector employees, or?
This was because of Wen-Ho Lee and the Los Alamos incidents. Wen-Ho Lee was accused by some of spying for the Chinese. When he returned from a trip from China, he was met at the airport in Albuquerque, I believe, and taken off to have a polygraph administered. And there was a controversy about whether or not he failed the polygraph. He passed the polygraph. It was ambiguous. Depends on who read it. And there was a big to-do about whether or not everybody at the labs, meaning Los Alamos, Sandia, Livermore, etc., should be polygraphed as part of their regular security processes. And I believe the legislation said they should be, but that the Academy should evaluate whether or not this was worthwhile, with the notion that it would get revisited. That's, of course, the relevance to the Senate committee hearings. Given the legislation, you would expect them to revisit the issue. So the report came out in, I think it was October 2002. In a printed form, it says 2003, but there was a pre-release version that was actually what everybody read initially. And then the printed version that you've got, I assume, was January of 2003. The legislation required that the Department of Energy respond within 6 months of the issuing of the report. That was October. So if you're counting, it's October, November, December, January, February, March, April, so middle of October to middle of April, and to the day, they issued a response in the Federal Register saying how interesting the report was and that they weren't going to change anything. At which point, I believe the Senate tried to schedule hearings. And these things don't happen overnight when there are other agendas on the table. The country was pretty busy focusing on other things at the time, like a few wars and the like. And by the time we hit June, I think June might have been on the table at one point, we were hitting summer recesses, and so the hearing didn't take place till September of that year. And I prepared testimony based on our report, what it said, what the response was in the Federal Register, and how that didn't really take into account what we recommended. It seemed to ignore what we recommended. And because of the way the hearings are run, my testimony had been submitted in advance, and I don't remember if I actually got cleared by people here. That sometimes is how, but I certainly passed it by people, and it was directly related to our recommendations. This was me representing the committee and our report, and not Stephen Fienberg representing Stephen Fienberg as an independent researcher, which I do often. And I have to make very clear what my role is. This was Stephen Fienberg as chair of the committee whose report was published. And I actually got to the airport. It's a fascinating story. I was on the airplane. In those days, I actually used to get upgraded. So I remember I was sitting in first class in the first row, and my cell phone rang. And the voice on the other end said, could you hold the line for Mr. McSlero? I didn't know who Mr. McSlero was. And this person gets on the phone and says, I'm Kyle McSlero. I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Energy. And then I realized I should have known who he was because he was scheduled to testify at the hearing the next day with me. And he said, I wanted to alert you to the fact that we've changed our minds. and I'm faxing you a copy of my testimony. Where should I send it? I said, well, I'm on the airplane. You can't send it here. Why don't you send it to the National Academies, and they'll make arrangements to give it to me. Can you tell me what it is? And he told me a little bit, but not a lot, of the reversal of this absolute position that they were going to continue to plan to polygraph everyone. And then next morning, I met with the study director from our study, Paul Stern, and he handed me a copy of this fax. And basically what it said was everything I planned to testify about was inappropriate. So in about 10 or 15 minutes, we rewrote the script, and I prepared a somewhat different testimony. And of course, McSlero went first. And so I got a chance to scribble in the margins, and he clearly was doing something beyond the script as well. And his Q&A happened before I ever testified also. So in some sense, the hearing was over before I got to the table, although there were some interesting questions and answers. It was a fun process. I've testified before Congress on a number of occasions before. In some sense, this is the first time I ever thought it really mattered, and where the script went out the window in a quite remarkable way.
Do you think that it was the Senate hearings about the committee report that forced DOE to make that change?
I can't imagine that without pressure to do something to justify their position, there would have been any reason for them to change. I mean, there's two different things. There's the policy that said, we'll polygraph everyone, and there was the reality, which is they've never done that. And so the April Federal Register statement was really all about implementing the policy that had been in the legislation way back when, and they didn't say how they were going to do that either. My friends at Los Alamos told me it had never been implemented, and after April, it still hadn't been implemented. So there's a complicated dynamics, and I'm not privy to all the details. What the Deputy Secretary said was, I've read the report carefully now, and it moved me in the sense that it moved my position from the one we took in April to a new one. I found the arguments compelling, he said, and so now we're not going to polygraph everyone, we're only going to polygraph half the people. That's not quite, it was much more elaborate, but it more or less amounted to about half the people.
What a great win, and at the same time, what a Pyrrhic victory, because you basically said it doesn't work, so they said, great, we'll only do half.
That's exactly right. And the great exchange happened in the question and answering of McSlero when Senator Bingaman asked him exactly that question. So he laid out the new policy. The new policy had different groups being polygraphed at different rates. High risk, high security people would have polygraphs on a regular basis. Random polygraphs for some others, an issue we discussed in the report. So this wasn't totally at odds with the report. And a bunch of other things, like the polygraph would not be definitive. And so it wasn't just the movement of numbers, but direct public recognition that the polygraph was not infallible, which is the way people thought about it in this context before. And Senator Bingham's question was terrific because he picked up our report. He asked the Deputy Secretary to open it to table S1, to read the numbers, and there was this wonderful exchange. He said, do you need me to give you a copy? And one of our staff members was about to hand him a copy of the report, and he said, oh no, I don't need that. It's imprinted in my mind. And then Senator Bingham went on and said, well, there's such and such numbers in this table, and if I understand the proposals, that would lead to approximately half those numbers being polygraphed every year. So let's just take those two tables and divide the numbers by 2. And then he went through the scenario, and he said there's a lot of false positives in this scenario and false negatives here. And how do you propose to deal with that, given that the Academy said you shouldn't do this at all? And it was an interesting exchange. I just commend you to listen to it and read the details.
I'm sorry. So at the end of the day, were you satisfied with how the Senate and the Department of Energy responded to the report?
Well, I got to go back to the point that there's a difference between the policy and what the implementation is. In fact, the committee that you just saw me come out of is about a committee on assessing scientific evidence for policy use, and one of the points we make is the implementation is absolutely critical, because what's written in a policy may have little to do with what's done in reality. So, as best I know, not much has changed. They're still doing polygraphs at the labs. They're not doing what the law said they were going to do, which is all to the good, I think, as far as our committee was concerned, because we didn't think they should be doing it at all. And compared to April of that year, it was a great victory. Compared to what I would have liked to see the response, it was not as good as I would have liked. And the problem is that it isn't just the Department of Energy. It's what we commonly refer to as all the 3-letter agencies. The FBI, the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, the USPO, that's a 4-letter agency. But it turns out that after 9/11, they got a polygraph office too. The post office had all this crisis over the anthrax. And so this was a big ticket item around Washington. To this day, I can't send a letter directly to the main Academy building because it's on Constitution Avenue and the post office stopped delivering there. And so all the mail comes to this building and then goes there. It's very strange. But the whole point is that the post office was in turmoil, and so many of their employees had, at some level, needed to have security clearances. And part of security clearances and the baggage that goes with them all over the government is still the polygraph.
When I tried to figure out what they were claiming the accuracy rate was, or even the denial rate, it seemed to vary widely from very limited information that's accessible from agency to agency, and even over time. You know, within the same agency, for example, at the FBI post 9/11, it seems that they had a hiring boom, but they had so many more applicants come in at the same time that their polygraph rejection rate jumped from about 20% to about 50%.
I confess, we did get a fair bit of information related to that. 9/11 happened in the middle of our deliberations. And that had actually a very substantial impact on the committee and how they thought about their work. We had very serious scientists get even more engaged in what the implications of science were for national security, because national security was now on the table in a new and different way. We couldn't get into this building in the way we used to, and so on and so forth. The thing about all of this was that that's anecdotal, and it's so hard to know what's driving the criterion. The polygraph exam at the FBI is not the polygraph exam at the Department of Energy. The science behind it is somewhat different. There are ad hoc questions there that are different, and the ad hocery needs to be measured and assessed. I won't attribute it to one agency or another, but we were told more than once that it's too bad that there are false positives, but we have enough applicants. We don't have to worry about that. We just want to be sure that people pass the polygraph. And the response, not from me alone, but from other members of the committee, was, but that's false positives. What about false negatives? Do you understand the properties of the exam that you're administering and what it's doing? And by the way, we don't buy the other argument either, but it clearly had convinced the people at the so-called three-letter agencies. I had, on more than one occasion, someone call me or come to my office to visit with me or email me with questions after they had failed a polygraph at one of these agencies, wanting to know what they could do to pass. I mean, the claim was, well, I'm being truthful, and they told me I failed, but I told them the correct answer, and they told me it was wrong. This reminds me of when I went to get my cell phone approved for use overseas, and I asked, it was a strange set of circumstances, and I actually went into an interview with someone on the phone, and they gave me a list of 9 addresses in Ohio and asked me if I had ever lived at any of them. And I said no. And the response was, if you don't tell the truth, we won't be able to approve your account for overseas use. And I said, I did tell you the truth. I've never lived in Ohio. I said, maybe you have the wrong credit information on the background, and you need to check that, because You can ask me this question any number of ways you wish. I gave you the correct answer. And her response was, if you don't tell me the truth, we can't approve it. And it didn't get approved. But that's what people say is going on. I told the truth then, and I was accused of not doing it. They're accused of not telling the truth because the instrumentation gave a response that somebody has said is deception. And it's usually about lifestyle questions, I'm told. I don't know if these people are telling the truth or not, whether or not they drank to excess in college or smoked marijuana or did something. All I know is that somewhere along the way there's a trigger and people claim to be telling the truth and being denied the opportunity of employment. Those are the seemingly false positives. The false negatives are the spies who somehow get through all of this, either because the machines just didn't catch them or because they've been trained to control the responses from their autonomic nervous system. That's what the polygraph is capturing. And as a consequence, are deemed to be truthful even though they're being deceptive.
So the things that modify autonomic nervous system activity include transcendental meditation, some breathing that karate masters do. Autogenic breathing is a technique they teach at Quantico and police firearms training.
Oh, you're better at this than I am. There's a long list of things that people claim. The two that you can read about on the web, I guess, and I heard in a recent television program, are flexing your sphincter muscle and scrunching your toes. So you never want to wear sandals to a polygraph examination because the examiner can then see what you're doing with your toes. But the other example, for which there's actually some experimental evidence, is mental arithmetic. Counting backwards from, and I'm not the expert on this, you may have to ask the expert, counting backwards from 20, which can be taught to someone, according to the publication, in a half hour, is sufficient to disguise signals that may be there associated with deception.
How does that differ in brain activity from reciting poetry or a prayer?
I'm not into that. That's not my department. I'm sure that it's part and parcel to many of those things, but that was the experiment that was done. It related to mental arithmetic, and it's at least as good as the polygraph experiments. Well, it was done by a polygraph researcher and his graduate students.
Fascinating. I'll have to look that up. Can you speak to the effect of the polygraph on morale in governmental agencies and on the ability of counterterrorism and other security professionals to do their jobs?
Oh, that's a hard one. You're asking me not to be a scientist anymore.
We'll skip it because we've got lots of questions.
I just know that there are people who choose not to do things because of this. But in some senses, they may be the same ones who would choose not to go through the hassle of security clearances for other related reasons. That's somebody else's bailiwick.
Got it. in your Senate testimony, you mentioned Ken Alder's History of the Polygraph, his research on it, and how it was used during, well, first of all, during Oak Ridge, I guess, to polygraph all the employees there. And then after that was shut down, it was used again during the McCarthy era to out homosexuals. Would you like to say a little bit about the history of the polygraph in these contexts?
Well, there is, if you go to our report, there's actually an appendix, which I worked, I saw it. Let me back up for a second. Our report is a committee product. And one of the fascinating things about the process here at the National Research Council is that reports really are written by committee, in the sense that every committee member essentially has ownership of a committee report. I like to tell other people that I write a lot of things with collaborators. And the time it takes to write a joint paper goes up as the power of the number of people who contributed to it. Why? Because everybody has to take responsibility for things in the report. And that means that multiple people write, people double check. If there isn't complete agreement on an issue, you have to find a way to describe it so that the committee as a whole will agree to the language. And that process takes time. I have an interest in history of science more generally, and so when all of this came up, I got to read some of the background. And there's a fascinating piece to the background, a little bit of which got into the report. The person who I tend to credit for the creation of the polygraph, in the sense that his original studies, which we could loosely describe as experiments, I don't think they're experiments as we would have recognized them today, is a man named William Moulton Marston, who started this as an undergraduate at Harvard and then did this as part of his graduate work training. And this started around 1915, and there were publications in a couple of successive years. He studied two of the channels, breathing and blood pressure, independently, and claimed to be able to use them to detect deception. He wanted to implement this as a national security instrument. And so at the time, there was an ongoing activity at the National Research Council here in Washington, linked to the First World War effort, and they actually had a psychology committee, and he made a proposal to them for implementing this work in the context of ongoing national security. And I found the records in the NRC files where he sent in his papers, and there was a back and forth. The committee didn't pursue it. He actually wanted to come and work here to create this implementation. He then implemented this in one of the most famous legal cases in the history of science, because it set the standard for scientific evidence for 70 years, or close to 70 years. It was a murder case here in the District of Columbia involving an accused, a man named Fry, and Marston tested him in his jail cell, I believe, and then proffered testimony that he was telling the truth, that he had not committed the crime. The judge did not admit this into evidence. It went up on appeal, and the appellate court, in the now Fry ruling, deemed that it not be admissible because it was not generally accepted in the scientific community. And that Fry standard stood until the 1990s Daubert decision, which said there are a multiplicity of ways that a judge should assess evidence. And that has now led to a whole new infrastructure for scientific evidence. It's actually fascinating. 2 months ago, I testified in what's called the Daubert hearing. So a Daubert hearing is a pretrial hearing that judges now often hold to decide whether evidence should be admitted instead of just ruling on it the way they used to do. And this was a Daubert hearing on whether or not polygraph evidence should be introduced in a murder trial. And the defendant's claim through the lawyer was that a polygraph that he had taken would explain that he was being truthful in denying having committed the crimes. It was a complex set, and there was a hearing to decide whether or not the polygraph should be allowed into evidence. The judge ruled that it shouldn't, and I actually testified describing what we had learned in our report and why that was insufficient, in my view, for this particular purpose, although I was very careful to note that our report was about security screening. However, the evidence almost all came from mock criminal events.
Right. There was an article in the New Yorker a few weeks ago on how arson evidence that was not scientifically valid had been used to convict a man in Texas in 2003 who was later put to death, and the right expert didn't get the file at the right time, and, you know, they executed an innocent man based on evidence that wasn't scientifically valid. But you can have a committee rule on whether evidence is scientifically valid, and it doesn't necessarily trickle down everywhere it needs to go.
Well, every state has its own rules of evidence. Every state has the ability to rule differently on the same science. And shortly after our report came out, there was a ruling in the New Mexico State Supreme Court, which I believe allowed the polygraph evidence to be admitted. There was a division of opinion in that court, and our report was cited on both sides of the issue. So different parts of the argument relied on different statements in our report, including, obviously, somebody arguing that it should be admitted.
That's an interesting leap. that note, how did polygraph testing come to be accepted by the federal government and, almost, I don't want to say by extension in all these state and local law enforcement contexts, but it really seems like in the security apparatus, from local and state law enforcement to any federal agency that has security clearances, this is accepted as valid, even though there was this early Frye precedent saying this fails the general acceptability test.
Well, but that's in a court of law in a murder case. So I stopped the story of Marston in 1923. That didn't stop him. He went on and he developed a version of what we now know as the polygraph machine. I guess there was Larson. There are a number of other people who did this in the context of police investigations. And Ken Older's book is terrific about this. He really has sort of captured the nuances of how this came into play in investigations. Marston was an academic of sorts, but he never had a tenured job anywhere, and so he went from college to college, and he promoted this in a variety of different ways, including in advertisements. So there's a classic ad from Look or Life magazine, but that's just the one I've seen. I'm told there were many others in which it was an ad for Gillette razor blades, and he used his polygraph, or his version of the polygraph, to tell which side of the face was shaved with a Gillette blade and which one was shaved with the competition. And there's and Family Circle magazine had stuff by him, and there was a famous story about. And I may not get the details correct, about a theft in a sorority house on a college campus. And apparently he used his machine to interview all the girls and decided which one committed the theft. But the point was, he was doing all of this as promotional, and of course his ultimate promotion was the creation of Wonder Woman. He was an interesting man. The kind of person you sort of think it would have been fun to interview. He actually was a woman's advocate at a time when there weren't lots in academia and in other scientific settings. And he approached the people at DC Comics about creating a woman's superhero, because all the superheroes that they had in the comics were men. And he came up with the idea of Wonder Woman. And the great thing, well, different people think they're great things about Wonder Woman, but in the context of our conversation, it's her magic lasso. It's the perfect polygraph. If you were caught in the magic lasso, you were forced to tell the truth, and it always happened whenever she used it. And so that was his ultimate victory. And people have been searching for a device for thousands of years to detect lying and deception. This is basically an interrogation device. That's how it was developed. And, that's a lot better than rice in the mouth and walking on hot coals. We've got technology now, and we'll use it, and it sounds pretty compelling. And I think that's how it slowly rolled into these settings. It's not that there's no science here, and I think it's important to emphasize that. there is a connection between the autonomic nervous system and deception. It's a very noisy connection. There are different channels for different people. They seem to do it differently. It's just that it's really hard to show that it can be done with sufficient accuracy in a variety of settings in an uncontrolled way that we would want to rely upon it. And that kind of science comes, that kind of scientific judgment comes with the accumulation of science over time. And we basically looked in our committee at the whole record of scientific evidence of the polygraph and assembled a file with 2,000 or more papers and reports, and then sifted through it to ask what the real evidence is, what of it we would really want to rely upon, and so on and so forth. But in the course of the accumulation of that evidence, the polygraph had become institutionalized. And there became a community of polygraphers and those who trained the polygraphers with a vested interest in having this technology used everywhere where they could get it in. And so by the 1980s, there was this industry of usage, not in criminal cases at trial, because the courts adhered to the Frye standard more often than not, but it was being used in investigations. It was being used in government security, going back to Oak Ridge, but it was being used for employment screening with no controls, no oversight, no evaluation. And that's where the 1980s activities came in. There was a study done, quite reasonable. I don't think it was as systematic and as structured as what we did, but it was pretty good, and it led to the law that banned employment screening except for national security purposes. One of the consequences is you had a lot of unemployed polygraphers if there would be only that, although there was this burgeoning industry in national security. And so they moved into other areas, like maintenance programs for sex offenders. And if you think we had squishy or less solid research about the scientific validity of the polygraph for security purposes, there is no evidence of its utility and accuracy in that other kind of setting. I was actually struck. I didn't expect to get into any of this with the expectation that I'd do anything other than chair a committee and write a report. And then this just didn't stop. I mean, it's going today. People like you come and ask me questions. I was interviewed for television last week for a closely related activity. I was on a radio talk show after the report came out, and somebody asked me about the use of the polygraph for this other purpose. And I was a bit taken aback, and my immediate response was, well, we didn't investigate that. So the next day after this was over, I called up the study director for our committee. I said, look, we've got this gigantic file of all these studies. Can you pull all of the studies that deal with sex offenders and maintenance release programs? So in our file of 2000, there were 2 or 3. And I said to him, Paul, why didn't we ever read these and talk about them? He said, well, you don't remember. You know, we had this gigantic collection, and the staff did a you created a screening list, and we didn't include anything that didn't meet a few basic criteria, and these met none of them. So I said, send them to me. So I read them, and they were really dreadful. And then I did some hunting around, and the web is pretty good for helping you to find people who claim to have results. So there were a few more things out there, and they were at least as bad as the ones that we had in the record. And so I started to ask people, is there an experiment? There's no experiment. How did they decide which questions go on the examination? It's sort of all a mystery. And it isn't, 37 states have laws or regulations mandating polygraphs for sex offenders released in these maintenance programs. These are quasi-judicial. So this is allowed when it wouldn't be allowed anywhere near a court for some other reason. And some of the examinations are pretty frightening. They ask people about sexual fantasies. And it reminds me of this new usage to guess malintent, creation of new language, trying to detect terrorists before they're actually terrorists or before they actually do something. And it's trying to detect, at least within a group of people who have some history, there is a little bit more justification, whether or not there's a likelihood that they might do it again. But that's a very different notion than asking somebody if they've lied about something they've done. And we don't have much research to go on for things like that. But there's an industry out there that's trained to do this, and it isn't just in this country. The British were looking to implement this in a whole much more elaborate way nationally, because they can do it through the Home Office. And it's one of the back and forths I've been having for the last 5 years, because it keeps coming to the fore and then getting put aside. And I don't know if they actually implemented this law, but I found it pretty frightening.
It sounds like thought crime, just to skip around a little bit.
Minority Report.
Exactly, exactly. Talking about these new technologies where they would like to predict future likelihood of the potential to intend to participate in certain activities that the state does not like.
Yeah. Well, at the airport, we want to get the man or woman who wants to get on the airplane and blow it up. I'm all for that. And if I knew a good way to do it, I'd be willing to surrender some liberties if there was really a device that I had some confidence in that worked. I'm willing to allow false positives if I'm really catching people. I haven't seen the evidence. There's a major difference between asking people about something that you can verify and asking them about something that you can't. I was sitting at a table last night with a group of colleagues from another committee, and they said, so how would you validate this? And I said, I don't know. That's part of the problem. I don't know what the experiment I could conduct that's double blind that would give me enough data to conclude that this works or doesn't work. And I don't know how to plan for it. And I'm not hearing any of these people saying that they're worrying about that. They're using it in some trial program. But I can't imagine they're using it in the context where I want to see it evaluated. And I find that pretty frightening because there's serious privacy issues. Because now we're not just talking about strapping bands around my chest and putting a cuff on my arm and seeing if my fingertips sweat. We're talking about somebody getting remote recordings of my heart rate, having a thermal imaging camera, see whether there's heat on my face when I'm answering questions as I've come running through an airport, somebody checking the blink rate of my eyes, and it may be that I had a really tough time in the meeting I was at, and I had a dispute with one of my colleagues, and it was very upsetting, or I may be late for the concert back home, or I might be out of breath because I had to run from the taxi cab that was stuck in traffic. And how do we distinguish among all these different kinds of things? And that record that they make may be used against me for some reason that we haven't ever thought about 5 years from now. And it's one thing for these people to tell me, oh, we're not keeping the records now. But tomorrow, there's no guarantee what will be kept or not kept and why. And I really believe there's got to be a very different attitude about how to assess things, how to maintain privacy protection, and how to guarantee people who are innocent that they're not going to be permanent records that might affect them in other ways later on that we haven't envisioned.
So that
I
sounds
need
like
a
a
break.
description of...
I'm going to take a sip of
Oh,
something.
yeah. Do you want me to...
No,
Okay.
I assume you're going to cut this part.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You've got a great flow from point to point, so I'm going to have to backtrack at some point because I want to ask you about
Well, I
fast
told you
now.
you were going to get
Yeah. Great.
Ah.
So it sounds like you think a lot of the threats to validity in the existing scientific literature on polygraphs are generalizable to these other technologies like FAST and Project Spot. Can you tell me a little bit about those?
Well, I was on a committee that triggered my looking at those. I'm not quite sure whether this was one of the consequences of the polygraph committee. One thing often flows to another. But another thing I do in my own personal research is privacy protection of data. And so that was another context for this committee. And we didn't evaluate the programs per se. for a variety of reasons. But there was a lot of interest in behavioral observation and related techniques, so we did have presentations on some of the technology. And I personally did as much reading as exists in the public